is Tales from the Vault, which is a collaborative program between the Illinois State Museum and Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum, ALPLM, in Springfield, in case you're joining us from elsewhere. And so every month we switch off, and this month is the ISM. So I'm going to be giving a talk today, and you'll see that I have some really fantastic objects that we've pulled from the anthropology quote unquote vault. My name is Brooke Morgan. I'm the curator of anthropology here at the Illinois State Museum Research and Collection Center. I help manage and oversee our collection of archaeological and ethnographic items. The ethnographic items we have are from all over the world, but we particularly have a significant basket collection. And so that is what I will be starting with today. The title of the talk is Life History of an Extraordinary Apache Basket. I think if you flip-flop them, I just didn't know if that's too dark for, is that too dark for the camera? We're good. Okay, cool. Yes, like I said, life history or object biography. What does this mean? It's the idea that objects themselves have a contextual life, if you will, a history that has to be understood within their context of use and their cultural context. That varies based on the time period, the culture that they are in, the individual who is in possession of them, how they're used in that society, how they're viewed in that society. And so it's not just anthropology that uses this object biography concept. It's a lot of the social sciences and art history as well. And I kind of tend towards life history instead of object biography because object biography emphasizes the objectness of something. It kind of already sets it apart as being a thing. And yes, in one sense, what we're talking about are things, they are items. But they also can be imbued with significance and with characteristics that are, for lack of a better word, living or human. And none of these in particular that I'm talking about today, a lot of these kind of characteristics we think of in sacred items, especially things used in ceremony, or I should say, beings used in ceremony. These are all utilitarian and tourist items. And so I won't necessarily be getting into the more discussion of life history of sacred things. That's where this really comes into play. But still, understanding an object within its cultural context is important and plays a role in how we interpret and learn about items as well. So these are some archaeologists who have this quote here: not only do objects change through their existence, but they often have the capability of accumulating histories, so that the present significance of an object derives from the persons and events to which it is connected. There's a mutual process of value creation between people and things. So we're sort of interconnected and intertwined with the things that we interact with. An item itself, like it says, can accumulate a history. And that's certainly what we'll be talking about today is the different ways that this basket in particular, the very enormous one there, may have started its cultural context when it was used in an Apache household, and then also how it eventually came to the State Museum. So the item that you see up there is an example of an everyday item. It's a musical instrument. Yes, it's a violin. Yes. Why is this significant? It takes on significance because of the context that it was from. This is the violin from the band leader of the Titanic. And so if there was another violin, maybe of this age and of this condition, but did not have this story with it or this context with it, it still might be interesting, but we won't talk about it in the same way. So you don't necessarily need to know the name of the person, which, this was Wallace Henry Hartley was the band leader's name. But you think of, when you go to museums and you see items of, Lincoln's whatever, gloves, Mary Todd Lincoln's opera glasses. Those are very everyday items, but because of their life history, who they belong to, the context in which they were used, they take on another level of significance. So we'll kind of keep this thread throughout, this idea of a life history and how the history of these items changes and accumulates through time. So I'm not going to give a thorough background on the Apache groups. It's very complex, but I will point to the fact that there are many sort of divisions of Apache peoples in Arizona, New Mexico, into Mexico itself, Texas, and Colorado and Oklahoma. And so the easternmost Apaches, the Jicarilla and Mescalero, are on the New Mexico portion. We are going to be talking about specifically the Western Apache, which is where most basket collecting was from. Maybe not directly from the community, but those were the basket producers. And so the Western Apache, again, that is a sort of generic description of 5 independent bands who have similar lifestyles, lifeways, adaptations, and they also, some of them make similar basketry. So in particular, if we see the kinds of baskets that we see here in our collection, they're often referred to solely as or only as Western Apache and not a sort of more specific classification or group. It's because there's, it can be very difficult to tell apart some of these older baskets because when they were being collected, there was not a lot of what we would think of as ethnographic information being collected. So when did this style start being used? Why does your group do it this way? How do you transfer knowledge from one generation to the next? Those things, some of that was recorded, but a lot wasn't. And so White Mountain and San Carlos Apache are 2 of the 5 Western Apache groups that have sort of this type of basketry. And so often when we see the term Western Apache, it will be referring to, in the context of these baskets, White Mountain or San Carlos Apache. And the Apache at this point, the late 1800s, turn of the 20th century, and certainly, obviously, much prior to that, relied on basketry for almost everything. All of their container needs for storage, for cooking. They would cook with hot rocks in baskets, for winnowing grains and seeds from collecting, for serving, for communal events. So baskets were part of everyday life. They were crafted for utilitarian purposes. Certainly there were baskets that served multiple functions and could have been utilitarian or used in ceremony or other contexts. So the thing to keep in mind is just that a lot of, over time, a lot of styles start to kind of meld between different bands because of the tourist trade and because there's demand from tourists for certain iconography or certain patterns. And so that's also one of the reasons why we might not necessarily be able to point to a single basket and say that's White Mountain Apache or that's San Carlos Apache. So basket making itself, there are 3 main techniques in Native American basketry: coiling, twining, and plaiting. And I already false advertised this talk because we think of the term basket weaver as just a basket maker, but actually coiling is a sewing technique. It is not weaving. You are not taking sort of a warp and a weft and creating a woven fiber. You are sewing using an awl. And coiling, you can see, is what mainly we'll be talking about today. But you can see that the base of a coiled basket starts with a little swirl. And it starts, and then you, in the Western Apache in particular, they go from towards the right in their coiling. Other groups will go towards the left. Some groups will vary, but most groups, if they do it one direction, that is the direction they go. It's kind of like trying to do something right-handed or left-handed. Like you can try and do it the other way, but it's not going to look as good as the way that you dominantly learn. So that is a cultural trait as well. And so the base of a basket will be coiled, like you see there in the top image. And then it will be added to going outwards. And so they are thin rods of plant material. And you are coiling fiber around those rods. And in a minute, I'll get into what all those different fibers are. But what it does is basically make it a very stiff and durable material. So that's why these things can stand on their own. You'll notice some are leaning, and I'll also talk about that in a minute. But it makes for a very durable kind of container. And so coiling, you can see I chose a picture that you can see some of the rods coming through right there. So the rods are kind of stacked on top of each other. And depending on the basket maker and the group, they will vary in how they assemble those rods and how they add the rods to each coil. And so, but here you can see that this one has some damage or some wear on it, and some of that rod is poking through. And so you might have heard of like rod and coil technique. Coiling is the same thing as that. And if you picture ceramics, if anyone's done hand potting and you do the coiling method, it's a very similar principle as coiling with basketry. What you're doing is taking, sort of your base and adding a layer, and then in pottery, you smooth them together. In baskets, you stitch them together with an awl and your plant material. So that's coiling, and that's mainly the type of baskets that we're going to be talking about today. The two other kinds are twining and plaiting. And so twining is, these are both weaving. And so twining, this is a close-up here of a hoopah basket from Northern California. So it's very, very fine, the twining. And twining was used by Apache basket makers. And the very far left over there, you will see we have what's called a burden basket. And that is a twined basket. And then also these two in the center, which are water jugs, those are twined as well. Everything else on the table is coiled. So they're not twined baskets are not necessarily as durable, but they certainly can be. They have more flexibility, I should say. They can be durable, but they have more flexibility than coiled baskets do. And then the last kind is plating, and plating is quite common in the Southeast. This is a contemporary Cherokee basket maker. So this is Cherokee style basket. And this is what we see with a lot of the kind of softer materials like reeds and canes, things like that. They're easier to plate than to do other types of basket work. So these are a couple of fantastic images of the basket making process. These are from the Arizona State Museum, and they or their affiliates did this really fantastic documentation project in the 1970s and 1980s with Apache basket makers, because what I will get to in a little bit is sort of the downturn in the basket economy. And the lack of knowledge being passed on. But here, wanted to show you on the left, that is that on the left? No, I'm sorry, I haven't flipped for me. Yeah, so on the left is Viola Taylor, and she is removing the outer bark from willow strips. So willow is usually what is used in Western Apache. That is the yellow that you see. It's not yellow at first, it is white, and it is the white little kind of shoots of the willow. So you have to peel away the outer bark, the outer layers, to get to the more flexible shoots inside. And so she is removing the outer bark. She uses her teeth to hold the strip. And I just think this is such a fantastic image because it really shows part of what goes into the actual, creating of the materials that you need to make baskets. It's not just gathering willow. It's, well, this is how you're going to be processing willow for the next, however long. And you can see on the right, to the right of her and hanging above her are two different kinds of burden baskets, which are shaped a little bit different than the one we have on the table. So that is the willow strips. And then on the right hand side here is Julia Francisco, and she is cleaning devil's claw, which is one of the best names for a plant. And it's she's using it in baskets. You can see it in the little white tureen that she has there. She's soaking it. And in the picture up to the left of her, that's what devil's claw looks like before it's processed. We actually have some in our collection as a reference example. So please, when I'm all finished and you come take a look up here, make sure to check out the devil's claw. So as I said, the willow shoots are used for the majority of the basket. And then devil's claw seed pod is used in the design. So that's all of the dark, and you will see either brown or black. It varies based on its natural color. It's not dyed at all when you see it in the baskets. That's its natural color. And of course, both the willow and the devil's claw change color and take on a patina over time as the baskets are used. Whether that's use in an Apache home or use, hanging on your wall at home and being exposed to sunlight or dust or what have you, those colors just change over time. And occasionally, I believe we have in the burden basket on the left-hand side, there might be some red in there. When we see red, usually it's yucca root. So it's used sparingly, usually in Western Apache baskets, but you will see it in other basketry from the Southwest for groups that have closer ties with using yucca for other purposes. Later on, so we're talking, in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, aniline dyes were used for a variety of colors, but they fade quickly and they were not really desirable in the tourist market. Tourists wanted kind of just the willow and devil's claw colors. So I've been talking about collecting, and collecting plays a huge role in why the museum has so many baskets. It's unofficially referred to as the basket craze, but there was basically a boom of basket collecting and other Native American art as well, but specifically baskets between about the 1890s and the 1930s. Train travel made it possible for people to take relatively inexpensive trips out west for the first time. This was something you couldn't do previous to this unless you were going there to stay or you had a significant income that you could use to go west. And so curio shops started popping up in different places. And you can see even that train travel, it was advertised as, a way to, yes, see all these things, but while you're there, look, you can go buy baskets or see baskets or see native arts. And so this is an ad for the Santa Fe Railroad around 1902. And you can see that they're using just a really nice illustration of a California basket maker and all the different types of baskets that one might find when they are going on vacation out west. Something similar actually happened a little bit later around the Great Lakes, and especially with folks from Chicago going up to the North Woods in Wisconsin, visiting reservations there and bringing back beadwork especially, but baskets as well. There's a history of ho-chunk basket makers selling around Wisconsin Dells and other tourist locations. So this was something that happened throughout the country. It was really a lot of fascination with and desire to have native made objects that were also considered art. So there was also around this time, the turn of the century, an interest in native art because there was the sort of idea that traditional lifeways were disappearing and that native people were, native culture was going quote unquote extinct. And so people felt like they needed to collect in order to preserve some of this art that might otherwise be lost as native people were forced to assimilate. It was kind of like a vicious cycle of like, well, we want you to be part of the mainstream culture. And we're going to do that in some very severe and terrible ways. And also we want to make sure that this art endures. And so there's kind of a cognitive dissonance there, or a disconnect between like what, I'm not saying these were necessarily the same groups of people thinking these things, but it's interesting that they happen around the same time. So designs of baskets would change once tourism became a big factor in the basket market, as opposed to sort of people picking them up here or there. Once tourism was facilitated by train travel, then basket designs changed. Shapes became similar across different native basket making groups. And so you can't necessarily judge a basket based on its shape or based even on some of the iconography or designs that we see on them, because a lot of them became an amalgamation of what was selling well. And that's, there might be special meaning for the people who were using the baskets, but when it came to the tourist market, that was more driven by what was popular with the non-native folks who were buying these arts. Yes, that's I was going to say that they may be the designs themselves might be executed a little bit differently from tribe to tribe, but there are only so many ways that you can stitch a human looking form on a basket. So you'll see similar forms across cultures. What's interesting during this time is that Native women become the breadwinners. And because of this basket craze and because they're able to sell their artwork, in particular, Native men are having a hard time finding work, and it's low paying work, very low paying work. So laborers may be working on railroads, maybe being ranch hands. Again, it's trying to get into sort of the mainstream economy while at the same time being paid next to nothing, which makes them, of course, then dependent on government services. And so, but with baskets and other artwork, women could contribute a lot to the household and community incomes. And this kind of helped facilitate a transition from into an economy based on commerce, as opposed to hunting, trading, things like that. So has anyone been to Santa Fe? Few folks, okay, cool. Well, you might be familiar with what used to be called the the original old curio store, which was started by J.S. Candelario in 1902. It was a curio shop with an ox cart on top of it. It was really meant to like, hey, like, here's your one-stop shop for all the native art things. And so local wares, of course, like trinkets and stuff too, like what you think of today as like a tourist trap. This was a very early tourist trap, but selling like really, really high quality, fine things. He ran that shop until 1936 and it passed down through the family. But this is what it looks like today. So it's the original trading post in Santa Fe, if you've ever been in that location, and there's still an ox cart on top. But it's on West San Francisco Street, and I think it's on the National Register. So kind of an interesting bit of history there in terms of baskets and their relation to this developing economy. So it peaked around the 1930s. Then, of course, 1929, the Great Depression begins, and people are not going out and taking sort of, pleasure trips to the West and spending their extra money on things like baskets, ceramics, and other things. So basket making diminished for a lot of reasons, but some of the most important ones are that by this time, containers had become, mass-produced containers had become readily available, cheap, and baskets for utilitarian use really weren't necessary anymore. And many of the Apache who were making baskets switched over to these mass-produced items because they were cheaper, and there was not a time investment required for them. I mean, baskets were still being made, but just not at the level, the scale that they were before. It just wasn't worth the time of gathering the materials and putting the creation into the work. As I mentioned, tourism started faltering around the same time. And then, of course, what had been going on and continued to go on at this point was Native children being taken from their communities and sent to boarding schools, where they were essentially told to not practice their culture and even learning about own aspects of their culture. They were taught to assimilate. So when they would come back to a community, they would not necessarily show interest in learning some of what were considered sort of the traditional arts like basket making. And so elder women who were skilled in basket making, as they passed and did not, were unable to share their skills and their knowledge with the next generations. Some of that sort of institutional memory got lost or just did not get passed on. And this was a direct result of sort of the indoctrination and the forced assimilation by boarding schools. And so that aspect of it is not talked a lot very often. We know that, of course, the market reasons for why basket making was sort of tapered off, but this is an intergenerational loss of a really incredible aspect of Apache life and other for other tribes as well. But that's not to say people aren't making baskets. They certainly are. So in the 1970s and 80s, there was sort of a revival by some of the women of the boarding school era. That's like we saw in the previous slide with the women who were making baskets there. And so today, the most common types of baskets, Apache baskets anyway, are the burden style baskets. The basket weaving is more common than the coil baskets. Coiled basketry takes a lot more time, and the burden baskets are a lot more variable, flexible, and they're more popular. So that's what people tend to learn and to teach each other as well. So there are concerted efforts to sort of revitalize basket making, but it's certainly as we become more removed, in time from the basket craze era, we will be seeing fewer and fewer of these sorts of items in coming to museums. Here are a set of, not a set because that was when they come together, but here are some Apache baskets in the ISM collection, Western Apache baskets. These are all of what's called the olla form. The olla being the Spanish word for a vessel with sort of a neck and shoulders and coming down to kind of like a vase form, more like a jar, I mean. And so it's used in both like Pueblo pottery and in basketry from the Southwest, that olla form. Western Apache basket makers mainly created oyas, shallow bowls, which I've got a couple up here from the collection, and then of course the square burden baskets, which I had mentioned. Then there are containers, like we see in the center here, which are meant to hold liquid. And you'll notice that they look a lot different than the other ones in terms of their surface. And that's because they're sealed with pinon pitch, and which is also sort of mixed with ochre to give it that red color. And that seals the bottles both inside and outside in order to prevent any seepage or leakage of the water. And so that's the water containers are rarely, if ever, decorated because you're covering them in pitch, so you're not going to be able to see anything through that. But there are different shapes of them, which I think is really neat. And I pulled a couple of different ones. We kind of have the standard water jar on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side is sort of a bi-lobed version, and it basically was used as a trail water bottle. So when you're out on the trail with either on foot or with your pack animals, you don't want like a big jug, like think of like a Nalgene, right? You don't want your Nalgene like bumping against your hip the whole time you're walking. That's kind of what's on the right. On the left is more like a canteen style. So you'd be able to wrap around the center there and attach that to your belt. And so it kind of like contoured to your waist, and it wasn't as aggravating, I guess. It was more portable and more, it was preferred for being out on the trail. So I want to talk about some of the patterns that we see, some of the figures and the forms, and probably the smaller three here were created for the tourist trade based on the patterning. The one on the far left might have been used, but I believe the center two are tourist items. And then on the right-hand side, this one I do believe was used for grain storage because it has a little bit of deformation of the fiber, so it leans one way a little bit more than the other way. And so they would have been used for primarily dry storage. When you think about, if you were to pour just corn kernels into a basket, a container like this, they kind of act like a liquid, right? And they fill every available space. And chances are, because these baskets are made by hand and not by a machine, there will be differences in the strength of different parts of the basket, just because of the fiber, the variability in the fibers themselves too. So over time, basically more weight kind of leans on one side or the other of the basket. And so you get a little bit of deformation of the fibers over time, which is a good indicator if a basket has actually been used in an Apache household for storage. Going back to the patterns, we see a lot of triangular and diamond shapes, very common. Other geometric shapes. And then human forms and animal forms are pretty common as well. And they become more common later on through the tourist market, because that's something people like. Who doesn't like little coyotes on things or a little deer? That's, it's really cool. And so we see on this one here, these are probably some dogs. Then we have what's probably deer. They do have some kind of like antler looking appendages coming out of their heads. Then of course we have some human forms, which generally are considered to be male, but just because they don't necessarily have any distinguishing features. And we do see, and you will see in the new basket, newly donated basket, that there are women wearing skirts. So that might have been, these are either men or just sort of a general human form. Again, you're kind of like, think about it like creating art with like 8-bit painting or something like that, or one of those perler beads, something like that, where you can only make so many shapes or forms without things kind of globbing together or being unclear. So that's why a lot of times, like, you can't really see any hooves or feet on the deer. The dogs don't even have 4 legs; they have 2 usually. Again, this is just like a stylistic choice of how to best express, you know, some of these animal forms. So yeah, that's it for that. I believe I did pull out some, so this, prior to the donation of this newest one, this was our largest Oya, and so that's the one that is second, sort of in the middle there. That was our largest, and now we'll move on to the one that's that we are here to talk about today. Before I get there, this is, again, going back to the life history and the object biography. So we sort of talked about, okay, the basket in context, used for corn storage, grain storage, which is what this one was used for as well. And then moving on to the tourist market and people, non-native folks acquiring art and baskets for their homes, and also for museums and things like that. So I want to first thank the family of the donor who provided the lovely biography, a brief biography of her grandfather, who is the one who came into the basket. So his name was Sheriff Len D. Spalding. He was sheriff of Bureau County, Illinois, so just west of Starved Rock. It's highlighted there. And he was a sheriff of Bureau County from 1918 to 1922. So I was kind of curious, like, as sheriff, what was his life like? And can I find anything about it? And there were a couple of old, you know, mentions of, you know, an arrest made, or like he had to testify about something, like pretty normal things, petty crime, things like that. Then I find this, which is Sheriff Gets Confession by Silk Robber. Spalding captures Chicago gang of thieves who stole $45,000 worth of silk from Burlington train at Arlington. And so I thought it was just you know, it's interesting to think about the background of the person who came into this basket and what, like I said, like what their history in Illinois was. And Sheriff Spalding certainly sounds like an interesting guy. And I wanted to read a little bit about from this this newspaper, which is from the this is the Bureau County Tribune, Friday, April 28th, 1922. So these gangsters had stolen you know, $45,000 worth of silk, and here's how they describe Sheriff Spalding's manhunt. The thorough manner in which Sheriff Spalding concluded his hunt for the Chicago thieves was fully as successful as the prompt manner in which he was on the jump the morning of the robbery, when the 2 truck drivers were taken into custody with their loot as they were entering Chicago. Since the day the truck was captured, Mr. Spalding has been working from it as a lead to learn the identity of those associated with O'Brien and Benton in the burglary. Several attempts were made by Chicago lawyers to recover the truck, but the sheriff kept it hid, believing that if he could discover the owner, he might get the entire gang. So I kind of envisioned like a small town sheriff, you know, being like, well, no, you can't have the truck yet. And in fact, I don't even know where it is, you know, as he was kind of holding out to try and find these thieves. So after he was done serving as sheriff, I don't know exactly what years, but it was in the 1920s. He worked for the U.S. Marshal Service. He wasn't a marshal or a vice marshal, but he did work for the Marshal Service, and he was sent out west. So he was on assignment in Colorado, and he was coming back on a train. You know, as you did to while away the time back in the day, on your train ride, you would probably play cards with the guys. And so he was playing a game of poker. Apparently they were not playing for money. They were playing for whatever folks were trading for. And he was traveling back to Illinois via train, and he won this Oya basket in a poker game. So it's kind of a, and this is not a rare occurrence. I've taken in other items that were acquired on or near trains. So I think about this basket making its journey from, where it had come from in Arizona, maybe had been purchased at a trading post or something in New Mexico, probably Santa Fe, or could have been taken all the way up to Colorado. The gentleman who was playing poker with Sheriff Spalding had acquired it, and maybe he was bringing it home to someone, and then he made a really bad bet. And so instead, this basket traveled disembarked in Illinois. And so the basket's been part of 3 Spalding households since the 1920s. And the donor, Penelope Spalding Newton, has been in possession of the basket for the last 18 years. And as I mentioned, she is the granddaughter of Len Spalding. It's important to know you usually don't get that history. When you take in an object or an item, the provenance of it is usually, I found this somewhere, or I'm the one who bought it, but I don't know the history behind, besides that. So I thought it was, a point of discussion or point of interest that the basket itself has been in one family for around 100 years. So here is another part of the object biography, and the fact that, an item can have a life history outside of or within different cultural contexts. This basket is probably more famous than any of us in this room because it was on Antiques Roadshow. I don't want to judge, maybe some of you are more famous, but it was on Antiques Roadshow because Penny and her husband, David Newton, who is there in the blue, they had been contacting Antiques Roadshow just to learn about the basket. What Penny knew was that it had been in the family. It had never been, it was always sort of given a place of importance or honor. It was only ever used to store dry pampas grass, I was promised. And she never saw it, being used for anything else. It was like basically a floor vase that was, like she said, she remembered being at her grandparents' house when she was a kid and seeing the basket. Then it passed to her aunt, and then her aunt passed it to her. And so there's like a lovely little history there too. So they contacted Antiques Roadshow, sent some pictures, and they indicated that they were interested, Antiques Roadshow was, in interviewing them. And so they went down to the Cheekwood Estates and Gardens in Nashville, and you can watch, there's a clip, it's season 27 if you want the reference. But it was a shock to them how old it was. I mean, they knew it had to be old, right? Because it had been in the family since the 1920s. But also the condition. Lost my notes. There we go. So this is, as I said, David Newton on the left. And then on the right is Bruce Shackelford of San Antonio, who works on Antiques Roadshow, who examined the basket. And David's reaction is one of the most subdued things I have ever witnessed when someone is told sort of one of the things that they have, which was, it's kind of funny, but I don't know if it's shock or just they prepare you beforehand or what. But I always kind of laugh when I watch Antiques Roadshow and people are like, oh wow, great, but apparently that's real. A little bit about this basket itself. The basket is 33 inches high. It is much taller than any of the other baskets in our collection. I cannot get my arms around it without potentially damaging it, obviously. It's incredibly large for this age, not because they didn't exist. Plenty of large ones existed, but they often collapsed under their own weight over time. And so they just aren't preserved. They aren't in museums as much as the smaller ones. and the fact that it was used. It was a utilitarian item in an Apache house, at least one Apache house. You know, that means that it got everyday use. It got bumped into, it got, you know, just all the things that you think about that can accumulate and affect an item over time happened to this. So the fact that, you know, it's dates to around 1900, it's in this fantastic condition, and it has a big diversity of forms. This was not created for the tourist market. We can see how, I mean, just masterful this basket creator was. Because of the variety of forms. So of course we have the sort of diamond and zigzag patterns, but then there are also what are thought to be male and female figures. There are dogs or coyotes, there are horses, there are deer. And what's really interesting and what Bruce talks about in his interview, and it was not something I've seen before on baskets, but that's not really saying a lot, is these squares here. Take a look at those when you come up. Those squares are probably enclosures that we think of as like corrals, but they were not for horses. They were probably for herding. Basically as part of hunting. That was hunting technology. And so wild game would essentially be corralled and dispatched that way. So there's all sorts of almost vignettes on this basket that we don't see in some of the smaller baskets and certainly not in some of the tourist baskets. It really is just quite incredible. And it also leans heavily to one side. And I actually positioned it in a way that the lean is not as apparent, but it really is quite apparent that it was used for corn storage. And so that's, you know, if it had continued to be used for some sort of storage like that, then it, you know, certainly could have collapsed under its own weight. These are rare simply for the fact that they do not necessarily stay preserved. There is some loss of what's called ticks or individual kind of stitches around the shoulders especially, but that's where you're going to get the most, that's the weakest point, that inflection point around the shoulder. So you can certainly look and see there are some missing, but other than that, it's really in fantastic shape. So how did it come, or what did we do when it came to the museum? So after they got their appraisal, they became very afraid that this was in their house and felt like it should be shared with the people of Illinois and wider, and that they would like to donate it. And so I worked with them to get it here. They live in Springfield, so their first thought was the State Museum. I don't even think they knew that we necessarily had a substantial basket collection, but I talked to them over the phone and over email. And I believe that Becky talked with them too. So they were very glad to be donating it. So it's really important to protect collections that come from either private residences or other areas that do not have climate control or intensive climate control or are subject to pests. And so that's one of the things, especially with fibers, that you have to worry about or be concerned about, I guess, is that bug activity. There could be bugs, even if you don't see any insects. There could be eggs. Bug eggs are small. And there could be mold. Mold is another issue as well. And so I talked to Penny about any treatments she had done to the basket, and she said that all she'd ever done was surface dusted it. She said when she had first gotten it, she felt really bad because she lightly sprayed some water on it to wipe it off. I'm like, it's okay. Well, you know, she didn't drench it or anything, but she never, used any, cleaning solvent or anything like that, which is always fantastic to hear and probably contributed to the fact that it's still in this condition today. So she always, checked on it, did some light surface dusting, and then she would periodically turn it so that it was not in direct sunlight, but even the light it was receiving, it did not get, one side got more light than another, which is again, kind of unheard of when you receive a donation like this. She's a basket maker as well, so she kind of knew how to care for items like this. So what we had to do was a decontamination protocol. And so what we did was this is very standard practice for things made of fiber, baskets included. And this is what Museum of Northern Arizona recommends, which they're like one of the foremost basket holding expert institutions. So I trust them, is to essentially, do a surface examination, and I did that, and there was no active, I didn't see any active indication of pests or mold. But what we did was bag it into a clear bag so that we could monitor if any buggies were falling out, and then placed it on a piece of foam on a tray in a box lid, and that was essentially to keep it elevated, to keep it up off the floor. It was then put on a pallet in our walk-in decontamination freezer. Again, so to make sure that air was circulating, excuse me, and that if there was a malfunction in the freezer, that any condensation or any accumulation, puddling of water would not affect the basket itself. And I realize now that it cut the picture off, but what we did also was take a thick sturdy piece of cardboard and put it over the basket on one of these shelves, and weighed that down. So again, if there was any condensation that happened to occur, on the ceiling of the freezer, then that would not drip down onto the basket. So this decontamination freezer is monitored regularly by RCC staff. It's kept at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. It was very cold going in there, but luckily it's not too big. We basically got it set up, and we left it in there for a few weeks, and came back, let it come to temperature in my lab, just thaw naturally. We didn't want to put it into the collections range yet in case there was something that we found. And so after it thawed, I examined it, no bugs, no mold, no casings, nothing. So I did a surface vacuum using these special vacuums we have where you can control the amount of suction. And so I just did that very gently over several sessions, because you can't just stand in one place that long, and surface vacuum this slowly. So surface vacuumed it, and but it was already pretty dust free. So with that, we decided that it was okay to bring it into the collections range, which is where you see it on the left-hand side, which is our temperature and humidity controlled secured storage area. And so we need to now find a place for it. That was essentially the decontamination portion. And I had several hands helping me with that, so thank you. This is quite a heavy basket. Yeah, that went okay. So with that, I just wanted to thank Penny Spalding Newton and her family for caring for the basket for the last 100 years or so. And the ISM is grateful to be able to continue stewardship of this this item and share with folks like this, and hopefully get up on the website some sort of little story about it, so folks from all over can learn more. I encourage you to come up and look at the different forms of baskets. I'm happy to take any questions.
How much does it weigh? What's the ballpark?
No, I haven't. I mean, it's not like, I don't think it's more than 20 pounds, but it's kind of it's awkward to pick up, and because it's kind of has some deformation on one side, when you pick it up, it's kind of like, whoa, for a second. You kind of have to right yourself, but it's not terribly heavy, but it is heavier than you would suspect. So they usually do 3 rod for 1 coil, and so I could probably count, but I know that people have done estimates based on inches, how many coils fit into an inch. And so I'd have to look it up and do a calculation, but gonna go with lots. Sorry, I know that's not a good answer, but yeah, it was certainly this probably, I mean, this could have easily taken over a year to make, which is incredible to think about as well. No, you're absolutely right. And it's, I mean, this has to be planned out beforehand, right? And so this is a mental template that someone has, which is also why I call them sort of, you know, like a master artisan, is because this is, you know, you can't go back later and add another dog somewhere that you missed. You know, it's extremely well thought out and patterned, and you know, you have to know math, you have to know geometry, you have to know all sorts of things in order to make this work, to execute it properly. Yeah, that's a good question. And the answer is maybe, and the answer is maybe because we don't have a lot this size. So the sample size that we're working from is really small. But there are other large ones that, yes, they have like different forms, but I think if I remember correctly, what Bruce Shackelford said, the expert on Antiques Roadshow, is that it is rare to have this diversity of forms. So yes, you can have a lot of animal figures, you can have you know, a lot of human figures, but to have all these things and like every little panel with something, that seems to be if not rare, then it's certainly less common, because there are images of some large ones in other museums, and they look more like the one to the left of it in terms of the amount of figures or amount of diversity of figures. So yeah, I mean, it does seem somewhat unique in that regard. One thing I did want to mention, everything on this table was collected in the 1920s from a series of collectors who either were on vacation or, for some in particular, really had high regard for native art, whether it was baskets or pottery or beadwork, and sort of assembled their own collections, which they then donated to the museum at a later date. So these are all from around the same time frame, from the late 1800s, early 1900s. But see if you can think about which ones might be tourist versus non-tourist created items. There's various reasons why they may or may not be, but I encourage you to kind of look at the differences between baskets that we know are utilitarian versus those other ones. So, and let me know if you have any questions when you're looking up here. I'll be happy to answer anything else. So thanks all so much.